A knight's armor was a complex machine of survival. We are about to unlock 35 of its most important and mysterious designs. This is not a story of simple metal suits, but of ingenious harness systems, the hidden networks of straps, buckles, and interlocking plates that transformed a human being into a moving fortress. You will gain a complete understanding of how medieval engineering solved the brutal puzzle of protection, mobility, and identity on the battlefield. We will see how a forgotten collar of mail could save a life, and why a helmet's closure mechanism remains a baffling mystery to modern craftsmen. What do you believe was the greatest innovation to ever come from a medieval workshop? The foundation of this entire story is a garment of astonishing complexity, a shirt woven from thousands of interlocking iron rings. We call it the mail hauberk, and to see it as simple chainmail is to miss its true nature. This was the first great harness system, a flexible metal skin engineered to move with a warrior's body. Its origins are shrouded in mystery, a puzzle for historians. Was it a Roman idea, later refined by Celtic metalworkers with a genius for intricate patterns, or did it emerge from the forges of Viking raiders who needed something that could withstand the chaos of a ship deck? The truth is likely a tangled web of shared knowledge, lost to time. Constructing a hauberk was an act of immense patience. A single shirt could contain over 20,000 rings, each one riveted closed by hand. The weight was tremendous, often surpassing 40 pounds, but here lies the first harness secret. It was not meant to be carried by the wearer's muscles alone. The design distributed that crushing load intelligently. The full weight settled across the shoulders and was then transferred down the torso, with some versions even extending into long skirts that split for riding, shifting balance to the hips. This was not a burden you simply put on, it was a system you integrated with. Wearing it was a ritual. Directly against the skin would have been agony, the metal grinding and chilling the body. So beneath it went the gambeson, a quilted jacket stuffed with linen or wool. This padding was the hauberk's essential partner, absorbing blows and preventing the rings from biting into the flesh. Then came the harnessing itself. Many hauberks were open at the sides or under the arms, and these gaps were closed with leather laces or buckles, pulling the garment snug to eliminate dangerous gaps where a blade could slip inside. A poorly laced hauberk was a death trap. Its great virtue was flexibility. A warrior could mount a horse, swing a sword, and raise a shield with a freedom later plate armor would struggle to match. But this flexibility was also its fatal flaw. While excellent against slashing cuts, a concentrated thrust from a spear or a well-aimed arrow could punch through the rings. The hauberk did not stop force, it dispersed it, and sometimes that was not enough. Yet for centuries it remained the core of a knight's defense. Why? Because it represented a perfect balance for its time, manageable weight, full body coverage, and proven reliability on battlefields where the sword was king. It was the resilient, adaptable base upon which all future armor would be built. Yet, for all its protection, the hauberk left the head dangerously exposed. The solution arrived not as an evolution, but as a revolution in steel. Enter the great helm, a stark, imposing cylinder of metal that transformed a knight into an anonymous, terrifying icon. This was far more than a simple bucket. It was a complete head harness engineered to be the final piece of a defensive system. Early versions were often bolted directly to the chest and back plates, creating a unified shell that turned the upper body into a single, formidable unit. Its design was a stark departure from the earlier conical helmets. By the 12th and 13th centuries, it had settled into a flat-topped, box-like form, sometimes with a slight taper to help deflect blows downward. The goal was absolute coverage. leaving no curve for a blade to catch and cleave through, but this supreme protection came at a profound cost, creating a puzzle of survival inside the steel. The two most critical features were known as the sights and the breadths. The sights were the narrow horizontal slits cut for vision, often no wider than a finger. The breadths were a series of small, round holes drilled beneath them, or on the right side, allowing air to enter. Inside this helm, the world was reduced to a thin, bright line and the sound of your own ragged breathing. Fogging was a constant, miserable battle. A knight would sometimes stuff moss or cloth into the breadths to filter dust, which only made airflow worse. In the heat of summer or the stress of combat, the interior became a sweltering, stifling prison. Vision was so severely restricted that knights learned to fight in a state of near blindness, relying on instinct, training, and the pressure of blows against their armor to sense an opponent's position. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine the claustrophobia, the darkness punctuated only by that sliver of light, the roar of battle muffled and distorted by inches of steel. It was a trait of sensory awareness for sheer, unyielding survival. Famous examples, like the helm associated with Richard the Lionheart, show this iconic form. But its use extended beyond the battlefield. In tournaments, the great helm became a central symbol. It was often displayed above a knight's tent or carried before him, emblazoned with his heraldry so all would know who fought within that anonymous shell. It was the face of chivalric identity, yet it completely hid the face of the man. This paradox captures the essence of medieval harness design, a relentless pursuit of safety that demanded extraordinary sacrifice, forging a warrior who was both monument and prisoner inside his own armor. But the great helm's suffocating protection created a new and deadly vulnerability. All that rigid plate covering the torso and head still left the limbs and joints guarded only by flexible mail, a critical weakness enemy weapons learned to exploit. The solution was not to abandon the hauberk, but to secretly reinforce it from within. This brings us to one of the most important and enigmatic harness designs in history, the coat of plates. Its genius was in its deception. To the outside eye, a knight might simply be wearing a colorful surcoat over his chainmail, but beneath that fabric or sturdy leather jacket was a hidden exoskeleton. Dozens of small, overlapping steel plates were carefully riveted to the inside of the garment, creating a rigid yet flexible shield for the torso. This was a harness in the truest sense, a system of plates suspended and distributed by a textile carrier. Its importance cannot be overstated, yet it remains maddeningly elusive. When the fabric rotted away over centuries, often all that remained in the ground was a cryptic scatter of rusted rivets and the faint ghost of a plate outline in the corrosion. Archaeologists are left with a jigsaw puzzle missing the picture on the box. The exact size, shape, and arrangement of those internal plates is a subject of fierce, ongoing debate. Was it a full wraparound cage, or did it only protect the front and sides? Did the plates run horizontally like the slats of a blind, or vertically like the segments of a lobster's tail? Each new discovery rewrites the theory. We know why it was revolutionary. Against the crushing blow of a mace or the focused punch of a bodkin arrow, a coat of plates was far superior to mail alone. The rigid plates would spread the impact over a wider area, preventing the rings from being driven into the body. It was the critical evolutionary link between the flexible mail hauberk and the rigid shell of full plate armor. Our most vital clues come not from armories, but from a mass grave. On the island of Gotland, the Battle of Wisby in 1361 left a tragic, frozen snapshot of medieval combat. Among the fallen, archaeologists found several warriors still clad in the remains of their coats of plates. The rusted plates had preserved the outlines of the fabric jackets in the soil, and the brutal injuries told a stark story. We could see exactly where spear points had found the gaps between plates and how the harness had been laced shut at the sides or back. These were not ceremonial armors, but working gear tested to its fatal limit. They show us the reality of the design, a life-saving innovation that was still being refined in the forge of war, a hidden secret beneath a knight's surcoat that forever changed the direction of armor's evolution. The hidden plates of the wispy armor pointed toward an inevitable conclusion. If small, internal plates work so well, why not forge larger ones and wear them on the outside? This leap in logic gave birth to the very heart of plate armor, the articulated cuirass. More than just a breastplate, the cuirass was a complete harness for the torso, a two-piece shell of genius engineering. It consisted of a sculpted breastplate and a matching backplate, connected by a sophisticated system of leather straps over the shoulders and sturdy buckles at the sides. This was not a static barrel of metal, it was a moving cage built for survival. The genius was in its shaping. Look at the central vertical ridge that runs down the breastplate, a feature known as the taphole. This was not for decoration, it acted like the keel of a ship, a reinforced spine designed to catch and deflect the point of a lance or sword, sending the lethal force glancing away to the side. Then observe the fluting, those elegant, parallel grooves often seen on German Gothic armor. This was medieval structural engineering. By adding these ridges, the armorers made the steel dramatically stronger without adding a single ounce of extra weight, much like corrugated cardboard is far stronger than a flat sheet. Each cuirass was also a masterpiece of tailoring, painstakingly hammered to fit the unique physique of its owner. The subtle curve over the chest, the gentle taper at the waist, it all served to keep the plate standing slightly proud of the body, creating a vital air gap that could absorb the energy of a blow. Inside many of these masterpieces lies a hidden clue, a small stamped symbol known as a proof mark. This was the armorer's signature, his personal guarantee of quality. Often placed discreetly on the inner surface, this mark was more than a brand. It was a point of pride and a legal safeguard, proving the armor had been tested and could be traced back to his workshop. For historians today, a single proof mark can unravel a mystery, telling us not just who made the armor, but often where and for whom. Putting on the cuirass was a ritual that underscored its complexity. A knight could not simply step into it, he needed the help of a squire who would lift the heavy backplate into place first, then the breastplate would be offered, and the squire would begin the meticulous process of buckling and lacing. The shoulder straps, called ailets, had to be adjusted for both comfort and security. The side buckles needed to be drawn tight enough to hold the entire assembly rigid, but not so tight as to restrict the deep breaths needed for combat. Every strap in this hidden harness had a purpose, ensuring the weight was carried correctly and that the plates moved as one with the knight's body. This was the core of the armored man, a mobile fortress built around his very heartbeat. The sculpted shell of the cuirass was a fortress for the torso, but it created a glaring new problem. It left the shoulders and arms as prime targets, especially the knight's sword wielding right side. How do you armor a joint that must rotate, swing, and lift with both immense strength and delicate precision? The answer was not a single piece of metal, but a brilliant harness system built from overlapping layers. For the shoulder, armorers developed the pauldron, a piece of defensive engineering that was often strikingly asymmetrical. Look at a suit of late medieval plate, and you will frequently see the left pauldron is significantly larger and more enveloping than the right. Why? Because in combat, a right-handed knight would present his left side forward toward his opponent, shielding his sword arm behind his body. That left shoulder became a primary shield, needing to deflect incoming blows from swords, axes, and the deadly points of lances. So the left pauldron grew into a deep, curved shell, sometimes flared out like a protective wing. The right pauldron, by contrast, was typically smaller and more form-fitting. The knight needed maximum freedom here for the complex motions of drawing a bowstring, wielding a sword, or controlling a heavy lance. This asymmetry is a direct, physical record of medieval combat logic, frozen in steel. But a solid shell over the shoulder would be useless if it locked the arm in place. The true genius lies in the hidden construction. A pauldron was rarely one solid piece. It was built from multiple horizontal strips of steel called lames. These lames overlapped upwards, like the scales of a fish or the shingles on a roof, and were connected by a series of internal leather straps and special sliding rivets. This allowed the entire assembly to collapse and expand as the arm was raised or lowered. You could lift your arm overhead, and the lames would smoothly slide over one another, maintaining coverage without a single gap appearing. This same principle of layered lames was applied to the upper arm in a piece called the rivets. Together, the pauldron and rivets formed a continuous, articulated tube of moving plate that protected from the shoulder down to the elbow. Harnessing this system to the body was another puzzle. The pauldron was typically attached by a point, a small leather strap that tied through a metal loop on the back of the cuirass. This single anchor point allowed the entire shoulder assembly to pivot and shift naturally with the body's movement, yet even this layered marvel had a fatal weakness: the armpit, or the void beneath the pauldron. This was a notorious kill spot, a gap where a thin blade or spear point could slip upwards, bypassing all the plate to find the vulnerable flesh and major blood vessels underneath. The solution was a small, clever piece of the harness called a bisseju. This was a circular or diamond-shaped plate, often attached by a single rivet that allowed it to swivel freely. It was positioned to hang like a steel daisy over the armpit gap, providing a last-minute, glancing surface to defend against a thrust aimed for that deadly void. Beyond pure function, the pauldron also became a canvas for identity and artistry. From its edges often flowed mantling, stylized cloth strips carved from steel that mimic the torn fabric of a real surcoat, adding a dynamic, flowing beauty to the rigid form. Every element, from the size of the lames to the presence of a bisseju, speaks of a relentless arms race between protection and mobility, where protecting the weapon arm was the highest priority of all. From that mobile fortress of the shoulder, the protective system cascaded down the arm in a series of interlocking pieces. The forearm was encased in the vambrace, a piece whose name literally means forearm guard. Its construction seems simple at first glance, a steel tube for the limb, but its genius was in its hidden closure. Most vambraces were forged in two separate halves, like a clamshell. These halves were permanently joined by a sturdy hinge that ran along the outside of the arm, the side less likely to receive a direct blow. The inside of the arm, however, was left open. Why? Because this is where the knight or his squire would fasten a series of leather straps or buckles, pulling the two halves snugly around the forearm. This design meant the armor could be put on and taken off easily, yet when closed, it formed a perfectly rigid cylinder that could deflect a sword's edge with a sharp, ringing clang. But a rigid tube would be useless if it locked the elbow straight. The true engineering marvel sits at the joint, the cauter. This is the complex, cup-shaped elbow guard, and it is one of the most intricate pieces in the entire harness. A simple steel cup would shatter bones with every movement, so armorers solved the problem with articulation. The cauter was not a single piece, it was the central hub of a moving system. Above it, several narrow lames of steel protected the upper arm, overlapping downwards. Below it, another set of lames protected the forearm, overlapping upwards. All of these pieces were connected by internal leather straps and specially designed sliding rivets. When the arm bent, the lames would slide smoothly over the central cauter, collapsing together like a telescope. maintaining a continuous shell of steel over the bending joint. When the arms straightened, they would expand back out. It was a seamless mechanical ballet happening inside the armor with every gesture. This leads us to a profound mystery. How did medieval armorers, working with hammers, anvils, and forges, achieve such perfect, fluid articulation without any of our modern precision tools? They had no micrometers, no computer-aided designs. The answer lies in a lost world of artisan knowledge. It was a process of meticulous, iterative fitting. The armorer would first shape the main pieces roughly. Then, with the client present, he would strap the pieces in place and have the knight move. He would watch, listen, and feel for any points of binding or pinch. He would then take the armor off, heat the specific spot, and tap it with a hammer, a millimeter's adjustment at a time before fitting it again. This dance of heat, hammer, and human movement was repeated over and over until the articulation was silent and smooth. We can still read this story today in the wear patterns left on original pieces. Inside a 500-year-old cowder, you might find a distinct polished groove where a specific lame rubbed against it for a lifetime of use. That groove is a fossilized record of a knight's most common movements, telling us he was right-handed or that he favored a certain guard position with his sword. These patterns also reveal the stark difference between armor for war and armor for the joust. A war cowder needed maximum flexibility, allowing for grappling, swordplay, and riding. Its lames were often numerous and finely articulated. A jousting cowder, however, was built for a single, terrifying moment of impact. It was frequently made much more rigid, sometimes even bolted solidly to the vambrace and rerebrace to form an immobile channel for the lance, sacrificing all movement for the ultimate reinforcement against a direct hit. So the humble vambrace and cowder combo is far more than just arm protection. It is a preserved language of motion, a dialogue between steel and sinew that speaks across centuries of how these warriors truly moved and fought. The arm's protective system ended at the wrist, but a knight's most vital tools were still exposed. His hands were his life, used for wielding weapons, controlling a powerful horse, and signaling commands. Protecting them without crippling their function was one of the harness designer's greatest puzzles. The solution evolved from a simple idea into a masterpiece of microengineering. Early knights often wore mail mittens, a section of chainmail integrated into the sleeve of the hauberk. These provided good defense against cuts but were clumsy, making it hard to feel the grip of a sword or the subtle pull of reins. The quest for better control led to the development of the articulated plate gauntlet, and by the 15th century, it reached a peak of form with the hourglass gauntlet. Named for its elegant, cinched shape at the wrist, this design was a complete harness for the hand. The back of the hand and wrist were protected by a solid, sculpted plate called the cuff, often flared to defend the tendons. But the true marvel was on the fingers. Each finger was encased in a series of tiny, overlapping plates known as gadlings. These miniature lames were connected by the smallest of rivets and internal leather straps, creating a flexible metal skin that moved with every bend and curl of the knuckle. A knight could make a fist, point, or grip a sword hilt with a near-natural range of motion. The mystery lies in how these delicate plates stayed locked together during the violent shock of a parry or blow. The secret was in the riveting. The rivets were not tight. They were deliberately left with a small amount of play, acting as a pivot point. The overlapping shape of the plates themselves did the locking. When the finger was straight, the plate sat flat. When it bent, the top edge of each lower plate would catch against the inside curve of the plate above it, preventing them from being forced apart by an impact. It was a self-locking system, ingenious in its simplicity. Often overlooked is the defense for the back of the hand, the metacarpal plate. This was a slightly domed shield that covered the fragile bones leading to the knuckles. On the finest gauntlets, this area was sometimes ridged or pointed, designed to deliberately catch and break an opponent's sword blade that slid down from a parry. But the ultimate expression of dexterity came later with the infamous fingered gauntlets of the late Gothic period. These were not mittens, they were individual, articulated steel gloves with each finger fully independent. The dexterity they offered was incredible, allowing a knight to pick up a coin or tie a knot without removing his armor, but this perfection came at a terrible cost. The complexity of forging, articulating, and assembling 5 individually plated fingers was immense. Each tiny gadling had to be perfectly shaped and matched to its neighbor. The internal strapping became a labyrinth. As a result, these gauntlets were astronomically expensive and took a master armorer months to complete. Many commissions were never finished, and countless designs were lost because the craftsmen who could execute them died without passing on the full secret of their construction. They remain some of the rarest and most coveted pieces in any collection, beautiful ghosts of an ambition that pushed medieval metalcraft to its absolute limit. The delicate steel skin of the gauntlet gave a knight control, but it was the armor for his core and legs that gave him stability. From the bottom edge of the sculpted breastplate hung a silent guardian, the fald. This was not a single piece, but a skirt of overlapping horizontal steel plates, a flexible curtain of defense for the waist and hips. It was the critical bridge between the rigid torso armor and the mobile legs, and its design was a masterclass in compromise. The fald was typically attached to the lower edge of the breastplate by a series of internal leather straps, often with a few points of flexible riveting. This harness connection was vital. It allowed the fald to shift and sway slightly independent of the cuirass. When a knight bent forward in the saddle or twisted at the waist, the plates of the fald could slide over one another, preventing them from digging painfully into his thighs or groin. The length of this steel skirt varied dramatically based on need and fashion. A knight expecting to fight on foot might prefer a shorter fald for greater freedom of movement. A jouster, however, would often wear one that extended nearly to mid-thigh, creating a more seamless defensive shell against a charging lance, but the fald alone left a dangerous gap. The front of the thighs, a massive target for any opponent, remained exposed. The solution was the tasset. These were essentially individual thigh guards, usually attached to the bottom lame of the fald by straps or turning pins. In their simplest form, tassets were rigid, curved plates that hung straight down, but as armor evolved, so did their articulation. Many were constructed from multiple lames, just like the armor on the arms, allowing them to flex with the motion of walking or riding. This ensemble, the fald and tassets, solved one of the harness designer's toughest puzzles, protecting the vulnerable hip joint and upper leg without locking the knight into a rigid, unmovable stance. The balance was precise. The plates had to be long enough to guard against upward thrusts aimed at the groin or the inside of the thigh, yet short and flexible enough at their lower edge to permit the deep bend needed to sit comfortably in a war saddle for hours on end. This leads us to one of the most striking mysteries in late medieval armor. In the flamboyant Gothic style of the late 15th century, we see suits with extraordinarily long, sharply pointed tassets that sometimes reach almost to the knee. They are dramatic, even intimidating in appearance. For a long time, historians dismissed them as pure fashion, the armored equivalent of pointed shoes. But a closer look reveals a more tactical possibility. In the specialized, brutal world of the joust, a knight's left side was his shield. A couched lance aimed for his chest could, by a slight deflection, skid down the smooth surface of the breastplate and fald. A long, pointed tasset, flared outwards, would act as a final guiding ramp, channeling that devastating lance point down and away from the body, past the leg, and into empty air. It was a specialized piece of deflection engineering for a very specific, lethal sport. So, while fashion certainly played a role, the exaggerated Gothic tasset may have been a calculated answer to a very real problem, showing once again how every curve and point in a harness often hid a secret logic of survival. The steel skirt of the fald ended where the leg's true power began. Protecting the thigh and knee was not just about adding more plate, it was about engineering a harness that could withstand the immense forces of running, kneeling, and the brutal impact of a fall. This brings us to the cuisse and pollen, a defense system built around the body's strongest lever. The cuisse was the thigh guard, typically a single, deeply curved plate that mirrored the muscle it covered. It was not merely strapped on. A series of leather points or ties would secure it directly to the padded hose or arming garments worn beneath, ensuring it stayed firmly in place without shifting during violent movement. In some designs, especially for the joust, the cuisse was itself built from laminated plates for extra flexibility, but its primary job was to be a solid, impact-resistant shell. All of this, however, was in service to the joint it led to. The knee was the architectural keystone of the leg harness, and its guardian, the pollen, is one of the most recognizable and brilliantly complex pieces of armor ever forged. At its heart, the pollen is a domed steel cup that encases the kneecap, but its defining feature are the wings, those distinctive, flared projections that extend from either side of the cup. These were absolutely not decorative. In the heat of combat, a low swing from a sword or axe would naturally aim for the legs, trying to cripple the opponent. A direct hit on the side of the knee could shatter the joint even through armor. The wing acted as a miniature shield, intercepting that blow and deflecting its force sideways, away from the vulnerable inner knee and the tendons behind it. It turned a potentially fight-ending strike into a glancing scrape, but the true mystery of the pollen lies in how it moved. A simple solid cup would lock the leg straight. The solution was once again articulation. Above the pollen, several lames protected the lower thigh, overlapping downwards. Below it, another set of lames, known as the greaves upper section, protected the shin, overlapping upwards. All these plates were connected by internal leathers and sliding rivets to the central pollen. When the knight knelt, the plates above and below would collapse neatly around the joint, maintaining a continuous shell. When he stood, they expanded. This hidden harness allowed for a surprisingly natural range of motion, yet this mechanical perfection would be useless without the crucial, often invisible, inner layer. Inside every functional pollen was a world of padding and suspension. The knee itself would be wrapped in a thick, stuffed arming cap, tied securely in place. The pollen was then strapped over this padding, but not tightly against the skin. It was suspended by its connections to the cuisse and greave, floating just above the joint. This created a small, vital space, a buffer zone. When the knee bent, the steel shell could pivot around the padded joint inside without pinching or grinding against bone. It was this combination of external articulation and internal cushioning that let a knight drop to one knee in prayer, spring back to his feet, or haul himself into the saddle of a tall warhorse. The evolution of the pollen tells a story of increasing specialization. Early examples from the 13th and 14th centuries are often simple, rounded domes with small, functional wings. They were workmanlike and robust, but by the late Gothic period of the 15th century, they became sculptural masterpieces. The wings grew more elaborate, sometimes sweeping into graceful curves or sharp points. The surfaces were adorned with fluting, etching, and decorative roping. This was more than vanity. The fluting added structural strength, and the stylized shapes could further control the deflection of weapons. A Gothic pollen from Germany looks dramatically different from a simpler Italian one of the same era, revealing not just personal taste, but entire schools of armor-making thought. each with its own secret theories on how best to protect the pivotal hinge of a warrior's stride. From the articulated knee, the leg's defensive harness extended down to the ground itself. The shin and calf were encased in the greave, a piece of armor whose deceptive simplicity hides a brilliant solution. Unlike the complex lames of the Poland, the greave was often a two-piece shell. A larger plate protected the shin, while a slightly smaller one covered the calf. These two halves were permanently joined by a sturdy hinge that ran along the outside of the leg, the side less exposed to direct attack in a typical fighting stance. The inside of the leg, however, was left open. This was the access point. After the leg was slipped inside, a squire would fasten a series of leather straps or buckles along the inner seam, pulling the two halves together into a rigid, protective cylinder. This hinged and buckled design made the greave remarkably easy to put on and take off, yet when closed, it formed an immovable barrier against the brutal, bone-breaking strikes aimed at a knight's lower legs. Its shape was also carefully considered. The front plate was deeply channeled, creating a strong central ridge that would catch and split the force of a direct blow, guiding a weapon's edge harmlessly to the side. But the true marvel of foot protection lay at the very end of this metallic journey. The sabbaton was not a clumsy iron boot. It was an armored shoe, a delicate harness of overlapping, articulated plates meticulously shaped to mirror the fashionable footwear of the period. If a knight wore shoes with long, pointed toes, his sabbatons would be crafted into identical steel points. This creates an immediate and fascinating puzzle. How could anyone possibly walk, let alone fight, in what looks like a rigid metal casing for the foot? The secret is in the hidden articulation. The sabbaton was not a single piece. The top of the foot was covered by a series of narrow, horizontal lames that overlapped from the instep toward the toes. These were connected by internal leathers, allowing them to flex slightly as the foot bent while walking. The most critical articulation, however, was at the ball of the foot. Here, the plates were often attached with a special rivet or a short, flexible leather strap that acted as a pivot point. This permitted the front section of the sabbaton to hinge upward just enough for a natural stride. Furthermore, the sole was not solid steel. It was typically made of thick, durable leather, stitched or riveted to the lower edges of the side plates. This leather sole provided crucial flexibility and grip, allowing the knight to feel the stirrup or the ground beneath him. Walking in a well-made sabbaton would have produced a distinctive, rhythmic clinking sound with each step, a soft symphony of moving steel. But then we encounter the extreme, the so-called bare paw sabbatons of the late 15th century. These were fantastically broad, rounded plates that extended far beyond the actual foot, sometimes making the wearer look like he was standing on two small sleds. Their practicality for active combat is hotly debated. Some argue they were purely for mounted use, where the wide platform could help brace against the stirrups. Others see them as the ultimate status symbol, a display of wealth so extravagant that a knight could afford armor that was utterly impractical for walking, proving he would always ride or be carried. Were they a logical extension of defensive design, or simply armored vanity? This debate captures a constant tension in the harness story, where the line between battlefield necessity and the powerful language of fashion and rank becomes beautifully, mysteriously blurred. The armored foot was a marvel of articulation, but it was the head that demanded a revolution. The suffocating prison of the great helm had to be abandoned for something that allowed a knight to see, breathe, and think. The answer was the bassinet, a helmet that redefined the relationship between a warrior and his armor. This was not just a new helmet, it was a complete head harness system built around two brilliant components working in perfect concert. The helmet itself was a masterpiece of deflection. Its defining feature was a gracefully pointed skull, a shape that was far more than aesthetic. This pointed apex was a calculated geometric solution. When a descending blow from a mace or axe struck the crown, the angled surface would guide the weapon's force sideways and away, robbing it of its direct, skull-crushing power. It was a helmet designed to save lives through geometry, but the true genius of the bassinet lay in its adaptability. It was the first helmet to regularly incorporate a pivoting visor, a transformative innovation. This visor was not permanently attached. It was harnessed to the helmet's brow by a pair of hinges, one on each temple. With a simple push, the knight could pivot the entire visor upward, locking it against the forehead to see the world clearly, talk to his comrades, or drink. In the moment before combat, a single, practiced motion would snap it down, sealing him within his private world of steel. This gave a knight something he never had in the great helm: control over his own sensory isolation. The evolution of the visor's shape is a story of trial and error. The early form was the infamous houndskull, its name meaning pig's face. This visor had a distinct, elongated snout with a single, narrow vision slit. Its purpose was purely functional. The protruding snout kept the vision slit several inches away from the knight's actual face, providing crucial space to protect against a weapon's point being driven through the slit. It also created a large air chamber, improving ventilation. Later, the more rounded clap visor designs appeared, offering a slightly wider field of view. Each shape represented a different school of thought on the balance between protection, vision, and intimidation. Yet the bassinet's most important feature was not the helmet itself, but what hung from it. The neck and shoulders, left vulnerable by the great helm's rigid cylinder, now found their guardian in the camail. This was a curtain of chainmail, a direct descendant of the hauberk, but ingeniously suspended. The mystery of its attachment was solved by a deceptively simple system called the rivets. Look closely at the lower edge of a bassinet, and you will find a row of small, sturdy staples, each one riveted securely to the helmet's steel rim. The top edge of the male camail was not sewn or riveted to the helmet. Instead, a leather cord was threaded through the final row of mail rings and then carefully laced through each vervel, like lacing up a boot. This harness connection was revolutionary. It created a flexible, shock-absorbing joint. A blow to the head would be partially dissipated through the movement of the mail curtain, rather than transmitting all that force directly to the knight's neck and spine. It provided superb defense for the neck, throat, and the tops of the shoulders against slashing attacks, while its weight was borne by the helmet itself, not the wearer's collarbones. When the knight turned his head, the mail swiveled with him. It was a perfect marriage of plate and mail, offering far greater comfort, vision, and situational awareness than the great helm ever could. The bassinet and camail system represents a pivotal moment where armor design listened to the desperate needs of the warrior inside the shell, trading anonymous, monolithic defense for intelligent, adaptable protection. The bassinet's flexible curtain of mail was a triumph, but the ultimate goal remained a helmet that was both a perfect seal and a perfect fit. This quest culminated in the armet, a masterpiece of harness engineering that enclosed the entire skull like a second skin. Unlike earlier helmets that simply sat on the shoulders, the armet was designed to be worn closely around the head, with its weight borne by a padded arming cap. Its revolutionary genius lay not in its shape, but in its closure. The helmet was forged in multiple pieces. The main skull piece covered the crown and back of the head, but the face and jaw were protected by two separate cheek pieces. These cheek pieces were not fixed. They were hinged at the sides of the skull, right above the ears, allowing them to swing open like the doors of a cabinet. To put the helmet on, a knight would lift it, place the skull on his head, and then swing these two cheek pieces inward until they met neatly under his chin. This is where the fascinating puzzle lies. How did they lock together? The solution was a small, critical component, the pivot pin or locking strap. In many armets, a metal pin would be inserted through aligned holes in the two cheek pieces, physically locking them in place. In other designs, a leather strap with a buckle would perform the same function from the outside. This mechanism created an incredibly secure, form-fitting seal that left no vulnerable gaps around the jaw or throat. The visor was a separate piece of this puzzle. It was typically attached to the brow of the helmet not by simple hinges, but by a clever device known as a spring pin. This was a pin with a small, sprung catch. To remove the visor for cleaning or repair, you would depress the catch and slide the pin out. This allowed for quick detachment without damaging the delicate pivots, a modular design that was centuries ahead of its time. The comfort and protection offered by this system were unparalleled. Because it fit so closely, the helmet moved precisely with the knight's head, eliminating the disorienting lag and echo of larger helmets. The field of vision through its visor was often superior, and the seal was so tight it could even protect against the splash of caustic chemicals sometimes used in siege warfare. This is why the armet became the helmet of choice for knights and professional men-at-arms throughout the 15th century. It symbolized a final shift away from the idea of armor as a bulky shell and toward the concept of the harness as a highly personalized, articulated exoskeleton. Each armet was painstakingly shaped to the individual's unique skull dimensions, a literal thinking cap of steel that represented the peak of the armorer's art, where protection and personal identity were finally forged into one seamless whole. Yet for all its personalized perfection, the armet was a helmet for the elite, requiring a master's touch and a lord's purse, the true workhorse of the late medieval battlefield, worn by knight and common foot soldier alike, was a design of sleek, intelligent efficiency, the sallet. Its silhouette is unmistakable, a helmet that seems to flow from the crown of the head into a graceful, protective tail covering the nape of the neck. This was not just a piece of armor, it was a harness solution born from the practical demands of mass warfare. Its origins trace a fascinating split across Europe. In Italy, armorers developed a more rounded, open-faced version, often worn with a separate plate gorget for the throat, but it was in the German workshops that the sallet found its most iconic and intimidating form. The German sallet swept back into a long, elegant tail, sometimes curving outward, that guarded the neck and shoulders from downward chops. Its face was protected by a fixed visor with a single, narrow eye slit, a design that created a profoundly alien and fearsome visage on the battlefield. To complete the defense, a separate piece called a bever was essential. This was a curved plate that buckled around the neck and chin, latching to the breastplate or to staples on the sallet itself. When a knight lowered his head in combat, the upper edge of the bever would rise to meet the rim of the sallet's visor, forming a continuous, glancing surface from brow to chest that could deflect a lance point upwards and away from the throat. The mystery of the sallet's overwhelming popularity lies in this elegant balance. It was significantly faster and cheaper to produce than a fully enclosed armet. A single skilled craftsman could hammer out the basic skull shape, attach a simple visor, and send it to be worn by a professional man at arms or a well-equipped pikeman. But its advantages went far beyond cost. For infantry fighting in tight formations, peripheral vision was life. The sallet, especially the more open-faced versions, offered a vastly superior field of view to the sides compared to any fully enclosed helmet. A soldier could keep his formation, watch for flanking maneuvers, and see the thrust of a polearm without turning his entire head. The harness system was beautifully straightforward. A padded arming cap went on first, then the sallet was placed over it and secured with a simple, sturdy leather chin strap. The bever was buckled on separately, often attaching to the breastplate with a strap or a hook. This modularity was key. A soldier could wear the sallet with the bever for a full battle, or just the sallet for scouting or fatigue duty. The iconic German sallet with its narrow eye slit, however, traded some vision for psychological warfare and supreme deflection. Peering out from that dark slit, a knight's world was reduced to a tunnel, but his enemy saw only a smooth, impassive steel mask, an insect-like predator focused solely on the fight. This simple, adaptable helmet, harnessed with little more than a strap and a buckle, democratized high-quality head protection, proving that the most enduring designs are often those that master the art of the essential. But the sleek sallet, for all its battlefield efficiency, represented only one path in the ongoing quest for perfect protection. Another design took the opposite approach, choosing to hide its formidable strength beneath a layer of civility. This is the story of the brigandine, the secret armor of the late medieval elite. If the coat of plates was a mysterious, internal skeleton, the brigandine was its refined and fashionable successor, a harness of breathtaking cleverness. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a stylish jacket, often made from rich velvet, fine wool, or even embroidered cloth, but beneath that elegant exterior lay its true power. The entire garment was lined with hundreds of small, overlapping rectangular steel plates, each one painstakingly riveted to the inner layer of fabric. The rivets themselves became part of the design, their polished heads arranged in neat, decorative rows on the outside of the jacket, glinting like studs of silver. This created a mesmerizing effect, a garment that appeared to be a simple, if expensive, piece of civilian fashion, yet was in fact a flexible, form-fitting suit of plate armor. The central mystery of the brigandine lies in its hidden architecture. How were all those small plates arranged to provide uniform protection without creating dangerous weak spots or points of rigidity? The answer was a masterclass in patterning. The plates were not randomly placed. They were carefully sized and overlapped in specific directions, usually from the bottom upwards on the torso and from the center outwards on the back. This overlapping pattern, much like the scales of a fish, ensured that a thrust from a blade or arrowhead would be caught and deflected by the angled edge of a plate, rather than finding a direct path through to the body. The plates themselves were often slightly curved to follow the contour of the chest and back, and the gaps between rows were minimized to leave no significant target for a weapon's point. Putting it on was a revelation in convenience compared to the heavy, buckled cuirass. Most brigandines were designed to open fully at the front or at the side, using a series of leather laces or sturdy buckles. A warrior could simply wrap it around his torso like a coat, pull it snug, and secure it himself or with minimal help. This ease of use was a major part of its appeal. But why did this design become so beloved by wealthy mercenary captains, traveling nobles, and even kings? The reasons are layered, much like the armor itself. First, it was remarkably effective. The small, overlapping plates offered protection nearly equal to a solid breastplate against most cuts and thrusts, but with far greater flexibility and comfort for long periods of wear, whether on horseback or during a long march. Second, it was the ultimate in customization. A patron could choose the outer fabric, its color, and the pattern of the rivets, turning his armor into a statement of personal wealth and taste. A brigandine could be made to look like a civilian doublet, allowing a noble to move through crowded city streets or attend a tense diplomatic meeting without appearing overtly armed, yet remaining personally secure. This was its most potent secret. It hid its defensive nature until it was too late for an opponent. In an age of sudden ambushes and courtly intrigues, the brigandine was the perfect harness for a dangerous world, proving that sometimes the greatest strength is the kind you never see coming. Yet for every lord who could afford a velvet brigandine, There were 100 common soldiers who needed protection just as desperately. Their solution was a harness of humble, ingenious practicality, the jack of plate. This was the true armor of the everyman, a design that turned necessity into a remarkable form of defense. Think of it as the brigandine's frugal cousin. Instead of fine velvet and polished rivets, the jack was constructed from heavy, durable canvas or thick leather. Between these two layers of tough fabric, hundreds of small, overlapping plates were carefully sewn into place. The plates themselves tell a story of scarcity and resourcefulness. They were not the uniform, finely shaped rectangles of a noble's brigandine. They were often irregular in shape, cut from recycled pieces of older, broken armor, or even fashioned from boiled leather or shaped animal horn. This was armor built from the scraps of the battlefield and the workshop, given new life. The process of making it was one of meticulous, patient labor. A pattern was cut from the fabric, much like a simple jacket or vest. Then, starting from the bottom hem, rows of plates were laid down, each one overlapping the row below it like the scales of a pine cone. They were then stitched into their individual pockets with strong waxed thread, creating a dense, flexible metal and fabric sandwich. The entire garment was often quilted with vertical or diamond pattern stitching, which helped hold everything firmly together and added an extra layer of padding. When finished, it looked like nothing more than a heavily quilted jerkin, but it concealed a hidden forest of protective plates. Its defensive qualities were surprisingly robust. While it would not stop a direct, heavy lance thrust at point-blank range, it was exceptionally effective against the slashing cuts of swords and the glancing blows of polearms. More importantly, it was a formidable shield against arrows. The layered, yielding nature of the fabric and plates could absorb and trap the penetrating power of a bodkin arrowhead, often preventing a lethal wound. This is a crucial point that demystifies medieval warfare. We often picture battles as knights in shining plate against peasants in rags, but the professional soldier, the backbone of any successful army, was often equipped with this kind of sensible, mass-produced protection. The English longbowmen who won the battles of Crécy and Agincourt were not unprotected peasants. Many of them were professional yeomen, and historical records suggest a significant number wore jacks or similar padded and plated defenses. This harness allowed them the mobility to wield their powerful bows while giving them a fighting chance in the brutal melee that often followed a volley of arrows. Yet for all its historical importance, the jack of plate presents a profound archaeological mystery. When the organic materials, the canvas, the leather, the stitching rot away in the ground over centuries, all that remains is a silent, cryptic scatter. Archaeologists might uncover a burial or a battlefield site and find a concentrated area of hundreds of small, rusted iron squares or horn fragments lying in a rough outline of a human torso. Without the fabric to hold the story, it is incredibly difficult to reconstruct the exact cut of the garment, how it fastened, or even how many layers it possessed. Each tiny plate is a clue, but the blueprint has vanished. This humble harness, born from economy and need, whispers to us from the soil in fragments, a testament to the fact that good armor was not always about glittering steel, but about the clever, resilient idea of layering whatever you had to keep death at arm's length. The humble jack of plate protected the common soldier's torso, but the knight's most vital area remained a complex puzzle. Before the elegant plate gorget became standard, the throat and neck relied on a different kind of harness, one woven from thousands of rings. Two pieces in particular held the line, the male standard and the bishop's mantle. The standard was essentially a thick, padded collar of chainmail. It was not a loose necklace of metal, but a dense, tube-like construction, often reinforced with extra layers of quilting or leather on the inside. This collar was worn directly around the neck, its top edge sitting just under the chin and its bottom edge tucked beneath the top of the breastplate. Its purpose was singular and critical: to guard the throat, the carotid arteries, and the windpipe from a slicing cut or a probing thrust. It was armor for the absolute essentials, the pathways of breath and blood. The bishop's mantle took this concept and expanded it into a cape of mail. This was a long, loose hood that cascaded over the shoulders, sometimes reaching down to the middle of the back. Unlike the tight-fitting mail coif that hugged the skull, the mantle was deliberately roomy. It was designed to be worn over other armor, draping like a protective curtain over the vulnerable junction where the helmet ended and the shoulder defenses began. The mystery of these pieces lies not in their construction, but in their integration. How were they fastened to the rest of the harness to eliminate lethal gaps? A standard flapping loose would be worse than useless. The answer was a hidden system of points and ties. The lower edge of the standard was often pierced with a series of small holes. Through these, leather laces would be threaded and then tied to corresponding holes or staples on the inside top edge of the breastplate. This pulled the mail snug against the body, creating a seamless overlap where plate met mail. The bishop's mantle might be secured similarly at the chest, or sometimes simply worn under the surcoat, its weight helping to keep it in place. What's fascinating is their enduring utility. Even as full plate armor evolved in the 15th century, these mail garments never disappeared. You might see a fully armored knight with magnificent pauldrons and a polished gorget still wearing a bishop's mantle underneath it all, an extra layer of insurance for the side and back of the neck. For soldiers who could not afford full plate, like archers and crossbowmen, these mail pieces were often their primary defense for the upper body. They were relatively inexpensive, did not restrict the drawing of a bowstring, and provided excellent protection against the glancing arrows and stray sword cuts of a chaotic battlefield. They filled the defensive gaps that rigid plates could not easily protect: the subtle hollow at the base of the throat, the complex slope of the shoulders, the turning of the neck. In a harness system striving for invulnerability, the humble mail standard and bishop's mantle were the flexible, reliable seals that kept the fortress from leaking at its most critical joints. But a knight's harness was not only for the chaos of the battlefield. For the glittering, brutal spectacle of the joust, armor evolved into a specialized machine, and its most critical components were the placard and the lance rest. This was armor designed to survive a single, earth-shattering event: the collision of two armored men, each with over a ton of combined horse and rider momentum behind them. The placard is the key to understanding this transformation. It was not a separate piece, but a heavy, reinforced plate that was literally bolted onto the lower half of the existing breastplate. This added a second layer of steel over the abdomen and lower chest, the primary target zone for a couched lance. Its purpose was to create an immovable anchor point. Welded or riveted directly to this reinforced placard, on the knight's right side, was the lance rest. This small, unassuming bracket of metal is one of the most important harness points ever devised. It was not a simple hook. It was a carefully shaped cradle, often with a pivoting or spring-loaded arm. Before the charge, a knight would lower his lance, tucking its thick, wooden butt securely into this rest. He would then clamp it tight under his right armpit, locking his entire upper body into a single, rigid unit with the weapon. This harness connection changed everything. Without it, the shock of impact would travel up the lance and smash directly into the knight's hand, wrist, and shoulder, likely shattering bones or dislocating joints instantly. With the lance rest, that catastrophic force was redirected. The shock was transferred from the lance into the steel bracket and then distributed across the entire reinforced placard and breastplate. From there, it flowed through the armored frame of the knight's torso, down into the heavy war saddle, which was itself bolted to the horse, and finally dissipated into the massive body of the charging destrier. The knight became a single, shock-absorbing component in a larger machine. This explains the incredible weight and rigidity of dedicated jousting armor. Flexibility, so prized in war, was a deadly liability here. Every joint was reinforced, often with extra plates bolted over the usual articulations. The left arm, which held the shield and would receive the direct blow, was frequently encased in a rigid, tubular vambrace that was buckled or even bolted to the breastplate, turning the entire left side into a solid, angled shield. This practice of bolting on specialized pieces has left a fascinating mystery for historians. In museum collections, we find beautiful suits of armor that are peppered with small, unused holes or have strange, out-of-place brackets welded to them. For a long time, these were seen as flaws or later modifications. Now we understand they are the ghosts of a knight's dual life. A nobleman would have a core harness for war, mobile, adaptable, and finely articulated. Then, for the tournament season, his armorer would transform it. The reinforced placard would be bolted on over the breastplate. The rigid jousting vambrace would replace the flexible one. A heavier, more enclosing helmet, like a frog-mouthed helm designed solely for the tilted charge, would be secured in place. After the tournament, these specialized pieces would be removed, stored, and the war harness would be restored. Those extra holes and fittings are not mistakes. They are the physical evidence of a harness that lived two lives, a testament to the medieval mind's ability to engineer not just for survival, but for the controlled, glorious violence of the sport of kings. Bolted into his reinforced placard, a knight was anchored against the shock of impact, but his left side still faced the oncoming lance point. For that, armorers engineered two of the most dramatic and specialized pieces ever created, the Grand Guard and the Pass Guard. These were not part of the core harness. They were massive, supplemental shields harnessed over the existing armor like the steel equivalent of a modern ballistic plate. The Grand Guard was a breathtaking piece of engineering. It was an enormous, curved plate that covered the entire left shoulder, the upper chest, and a significant portion of the upper arm. Its size was not for show. It was a calculated deflection ramp. The entire design philosophy was to take a direct lance strike, which was aiming for the center of mass, and guide it outwards. The Grand Guard's surface was deeply curved and polished to a mirror shine, creating a slick, glancing plane. When a lance tip hit, instead of digging in and punching through, it would skid across this surface, its force redirected harmlessly away from the body's core and over the knight's left shoulder. It turned a potentially fatal impact into a spectacular shower of splinters. Supporting this primary shield was the Pass Guard, a heavily reinforced shell for the left elbow. This was not the finely articulated counter used in war. The Pass Guard was often a single, massively thick piece of steel or a series of plates riveted solidly together. Its job was to be an immovable anvil. In the violent twist of impact, an elbow could be smashed against the breastplate or the saddle. The Pass Guard ensured that joint remained locked and protected, a rigid link in the defensive chain. The true mystery of these pieces lies not in their form, but in their fleeting attachment. How do you securely fasten a 20-pound steel shield to a moving man, knowing it must withstand a catastrophic collision, yet be removable in minutes? The systems were marvels of practical ingenuity. The Grand Guard was harnessed by a complex web of leather straps. Some would loop around the arm, others would tie to staples on the breastplate or backplate. Many designs featured a large central hook on the inside of the Grand Guard that would latch over a special bracket welded to the breastplate for the event. This hook and bracket system created a solid, mechanical lock that took the initial brunt of the force, while the straps kept everything from shifting. For the Pass Guard, attachment could be even more temporary. Some were secured with sturdy buckles, but evidence suggests some armorers used soft iron rivets. These were special rivets made to be easily drilled out after the joust. A squire would quickly fasten the pass guard, tap in the rivet to lock it, and after the pass, he would drill out the soft metal head to remove the piece. This practice of temporary attachment explains a profound archaeological silence. For historians, finding a complete, assembled jousting harness is extraordinarily rare. More often, we find the core armor, and then, in a separate crate or display, we find the grand guard and pass guard. Their connection to a specific suit is lost because the evidence, those temporary straps, those drilled-out rivet holes, is organic or too subtle to trace. These pieces were the ultimate expression of single-purpose design. They turned a knight into a temporary, near impenetrable fortress for one 30-second charge down the tilt lane. Once the clash was over and the victory or defeat was decided, the squire's hands would work quickly, unbuckling, unhooking, and removing these bulky appendages. The knight would shed his specialized shell, returning to a more mobile form, while the grand guard and pass guard were stored away until the next tournament, leaving almost no physical proof of their crucial, momentary alliance with the man inside. The grand guard was a fortress for the charge, but the true armor of a knight was never just plate alone. Underneath that gleaming shell, in the dark, unseen spaces where steel plates met, a different kind of protection was always at work. We must now uncover the secret of the chainmail voiders. In the age of magnificent full plate, the ancient mail hauberk did not vanish. It evolved, shrinking from a full shirt into targeted patches of flexible defense. These were the voiders, pieces of chainmail specifically shaped to protect the most vulnerable gaps in the plate harness, the open hollow of the armpit, the inner bend of the elbow, the soft flesh of the groin, and the back of the knee. Their name says it all. They filled the voids, the deadly empty spaces that rigid plates could not possibly cover without locking the wearer in place. The mystery of the voiders is one of invisibility. Look at a polished suit of armor in a museum display, or study a detailed painting of a knight from the 15th century. You see the whole beautiful sculpture of plate, but you almost never see the mail. That is because it was worn underneath, a hidden layer of security. This reveals the profound truth that a so-called full plate harness was almost always a hybrid system, a brilliant marriage of rigid deflection and flexible, woven stopping power. Take the most critical voiders, the gussets of mail for the armpits. The pauldron protected the top of the shoulder, but beneath it was a triangular gap, a direct path to the heart and lungs. A simple patch of mail sewn onto the arming doublet would not suffice, as it could bunch and shift. Instead, the mail gusset was a masterfully tailored piece, often shaped like a small sleeve or a diamond. It was not simply worn under the arm, it was actively harnessed to the armor itself. Leather points or laces sewn to the edges of the mail would be threaded through corresponding holes in the inside edge of the breastplate and the underside of the pauldron. When tightened, this pulled the mail gusset taut, suspending it perfectly in that vulnerable void. It created a flexible, mesh curtain that moved with the arm's rotation. A dagger thrust or an arrow aimed for that gap would meet not empty air, but a dense weave of steel rings that could catch and slow the point, often turning a killing blow into a survivable wound. The same principle applied elsewhere. Voiders for the inner elbow allowed the arm to bend freely while guarding the exposed veins. A mail skirt, called a skirt of mail or a pair of mail breeches, was often worn under the fald and tassets to protect the groin and upper thighs, areas where a solid plate would be impossibly restrictive for mounting a horse. This hidden network of mail was the armor's final, essential safety net. It asked a simple, brutal question: what happens when the perfect deflection of the plate fails, and a weapon's point finds the 1 inch of emptiness it was designed for? The voiders were the answer, the last-ditch, flexible defense that made a knight's harness not just a brilliant sculpture, but a truly integrated system of survival, where the old technology of the forge and the anvil worked in silent concert with the ancient craft of the mail maker. Yet for all the steel above it, the true foundation of every harness was not metal, but cloth. The gambeson was the unsung hero of medieval defense, a quilted jacket of humble materials that made the wearing of armor possible. This was the first and most intimate layer of the entire harness system, a second skin between a warrior and his shell. Its construction was deceptively simple. Tailors would take dozens of layers of tough linen or wool fabric and sandwich between them a stuffing of tow, which is the coarse fibers left over from processing flax, or sometimes chopped wool, or even scraps of old cloth. These layers were then stitched together with thousands of careful, tight stitches, creating a dense, padded matrix. The quilting patterns you see on surviving examples are not merely decorative. Those lines of stitching served a critical engineering purpose. They created countless small, sealed pockets that kept the stuffing from clumping or shifting to one side during violent movement, ensuring the padding remained uniformly protective across the entire garment. The gambeson's primary role was one of brutal necessity to absorb shock. A direct blow from a mace on a steel breastplate does not just dent the metal. The terrifying force of that impact travels through the plate and into the body. Without a cushion, it would shatter ribs, rupture organs, and cause massive internal bleeding even without breaking the skin. The gambeson acted as a shock absorber, spreading that concentrated force over a wider area and dissipating its energy through the compression of its fibrous layers. It literally saved knights from their own armor, but its genius was dual. It also provided a comfortable, breathable base layer. Metal worn directly against the skin is a recipe for misery, chafing, pinching, and in summer, unbearable heat. The gambeson's natural fibers wicked moisture away and created a protective buffer, making it possible to endure the harness for hours. This leads us to a fascinating mystery of thickness. Not all gambesons were created equal. Some, often called arming doublets, were relatively thin garments. These were designed specifically to be worn under full plate armor, their primary job being comfort and a secure anchor point for tying on the steel plates via leather points. But other gambesons were monumental, worn by foot soldiers, archers, and men-at-arms who could not afford full plate. These were stand-alone defenses, sometimes several inches thick. Historical accounts and modern tests suggest a well-made, thick gambeson could indeed stop arrows, especially at longer ranges. The layers of cloth and fiber would entangle and trap a bodkin arrowhead, robbing it of its penetrating power. This humble padded jacket was, for many, their primary harness, so when we picture a knight, we must see not just the glittering shell, but this essential, quilted foundation beneath it all, the soft, resilient core that made the hard exterior not just wearable, but survivable. Over the quilted gambeson and the gleaming plates, a knight wore his final layer, a garment of brilliant color and profound meaning. This was the surcoat, and later the tabard, a piece of the harness with no physical defense, yet vital to the knight's very identity. In the early medieval period, the surcoat was a practical innovation. It was a long, sleeveless robe of linen or silk, worn over the chainmail hauberk. Its primary purpose was surprisingly mundane. It was a sun shield. Under the relentless summer sun, a hauberk of 20,000 iron rings could become a baking oven, scorching the skin beneath. The light-colored surcoat reflected that heat, keeping the metal cooler and the knight more comfortable during long marches or sieges. It also kept dust and rain off the mail, helping to prevent the creeping rust that could weaken the links. But as armor evolved from mail to plate, the surcoat evolved with it. By the 14th century, it had shortened dramatically into the juppon. This was a tight-fitting, padded garment that was often embroidered or painted directly with the knight's heraldic symbols. It hugged the new, sculpted form of the plate cuirass, showcasing the knight's shape rather than concealing it. The juppon was both a badge of pride and a functional piece, its padding offering one last thin layer of shock absorption. Yet the ultimate expression of this idea was the tabard. This was a simple, sleeveless coat, open at the sides, often emblazoned front and back with the full, glorious display of a knight's coat of arms. Its function was instant, crucial communication. On a smoke-choked battlefield crowded with hundreds of identically armored men, a quick glimpse of a lion rampant or a chevron of gold could tell a friend from a foe in a split second. It was a uniform and a walking billboard of lineage, declaring a knight's family, his lord, and his loyalties for all to see. This presents a charming mystery. How did these flimsy silks and linens survive the brutal chaos of combat? They likely did not for long. Evidence suggests tabards and surcoats were often donned just before the battle or tournament commenced, after the knight was fully armored. They were part of the final ritual. A squire would help slip the garment over the helmet and settle it across the shoulders, securing it with simple ties at the sides. In the thick of melee, they would be slashed by swords, stained with mud and blood, and torn from the body, but that was almost the point. They served their purpose in those first critical moments of recognition and pageantry. To wear your colors into battle was to stake your reputation and your life upon them, a declaration made not in words, but in woven thread and dyed fabric, a final, brilliant layer of the harness that protected not the body, but the very idea of the man inside it. The brilliant colors of a knight's tabard were a declaration, but they were draped over a partnership forged in steel. A knight's harness was incomplete without its living counterpart, a second suit of armor for the most vital creature on the battlefield, his warhorse. This was the barding, a full harness system that transformed a powerful animal into an armored engine of war. To see a destrier clad in full plate was to witness a moving fortress, a breathtaking and terrifying display of wealth and martial power. The system was built from several key components, each protecting a critical area. The chanfron was the helmet for the horse, a sculpted plate of steel or boiled leather that shielded its face, often featuring hinged cheekpieces and even decorative, spiraling horns or a sharp, central spike to intimidate enemy horses. Protecting the vulnerable neck was the crinnet, a series of overlapping steel lames or a curtain of mail that moved with the animal's powerful muscles as it tossed its head. The chest was guarded by the patral, a large, curved plate that deflected lance thrusts and sword blows, often beautifully etched with the knight's own heraldry. And at the rear, the hindquarters were covered by the crupper, a similar arrangement of plates or leather to protect against attacks from behind. These pieces were not simply thrown on. They were harnessed together over a padded caparison, a quilted cloth covering that served the same essential purpose as the knight's gambeson, absorbing shock and preventing chafing. A network of leather straps and buckles, carefully fitted to avoid the horse's joints and range of motion, held the entire assembly in place. This raises an immediate and practical mystery. How could a horse, already carrying a heavily armored man, move and breathe under an additional 80 or even 100 pounds of steel and leather? The answer lies in specialized breeding and a lifetime of training. The destrier was not a common plow horse. It was a massive, muscular breed, the medieval equivalent of a heavy draft horse, selectively bred for strength, stamina, and a calm temperament in the chaos of combat. From a young age, these horses were acclimated to weight. Training began with light cloths, then heavier padding, then pieces of leather, and finally the full metal barding. They were taught to accept the strange sounds and restricted vision, to respond to subtle leg pressures from a rider whose own movements were encumbered. The partnership was one of profound mutual trust. The expense of this equine harness was astronomical, far exceeding the cost of the knight's own armor. A full set of plate barding required the same master craftsmanship, the same tons of steel, and countless hours of fitting. It was the ultimate status symbol, a visible declaration that its owner commanded resources beyond imagination. This is why its use was always limited to the highest nobility and why its decline was so definitive. With the rise of reliable gunpowder weapons and the shift toward faster, lighter cavalry tactics in the 16th century, the magnificent but ponderous armored horse became a magnificent relic. The plate barding was retired, leaving behind a legacy of artistry that speaks to a time when the bond between knight and steed was so complete, it was literally clad in matching steel. But the most dynamic piece of a knight's harness was often the one he held in his hand. The shield was an active part of his defensive system, a mobile fortress wall that evolved dramatically across the medieval centuries. Its story begins with the iconic Norman kite shield, a massive, teardrop-shaped barrier of wood and leather that stretched from shoulder to shin. This was a harness for survival on foot and horseback, designed to protect the entire left side of a warrior whose body was still primarily clad in vulnerable mail. Its long, tapering point guarded the leg while riding, and its broad upper curve covered the shoulder and head. Holding such a large object required a sophisticated harnessing system. On the inside were the N-arms, two sturdy leather straps arranged in a V-shape. The knight would slide his forearm through these, allowing the shield's weight to be borne by his entire limb, not just his grip. His hand would then close around a central grip, called the boss grip, positioned behind the metal dome, or boss, that reinforced the shield's center. But there was a third, crucial strap, the guide. This was a long leather sling worn around the neck. When not in active combat, a knight could hang the heavy shield from his neck to rest his arm. In a charge, he could let it hang freely to wield his lance with both hands, then snatch it up again as he closed for melee. The guide was the shield's lifeline, a simple strap that made it a versatile, manageable part of his kit. Yet as plate armor improved, the shield began to shrink. By the 13th century, the large kite had evolved into the shorter, more triangular heater shield. This was the classic emblem of knighthood. Its smaller size reflected a new reality, with a well-fitted cuirass, pauldrons, and vambraces protecting the torso and left arm. A knight no longer needed a wall of wood. He needed a nimble, active parrying tool. The heater shield was perfectly balanced for this, light enough to be snapped into position to deflect a blow, its pointed bottom still offering some protection for the thigh. But then, in the 15th century, a profound shift occurred. In countless paintings and effigies of fully armored knights from this period, the shield is simply gone. Why would a warrior abandon a piece of equipment that had been central to defense for over 1,000 years? The answer is a fascinating story of trade-offs. As plate armor became so complete and so expertly articulated, it essentially became its own shield. A knight's left side was already a glancing surface of polished steel. Carrying a separate shield became redundant weight, and, more importantly, it occupied the left hand. This was the critical change. The martial arts of the fully armored knight, documented in detailed fighting manuals called fetchbücher, revolved around the use of two-handed weapons like the longsword. These weapons were not just for swinging, they were used half-sword, with one hand on the blade and one on the hilt, for precise thrusts into the gaps of an opponent's armor. They could be gripped at the crossguard and used as a short spear, or reversed to hammer with the pommel. This sophisticated, brutal style required both hands. The knight's armored left arm itself became the primary parrying tool, actively blocking and binding an opponent's weapon to create an opening for a deadly counter thrust. The shield was not so much discarded as it was integrated. Its function was absorbed into the very plates on the arm, yet this evolution was exclusive to the knightly elite. For the common infantryman, the archer, or the lightly armored cavalryman, the shield remained an absolute necessity. The pavis, a massive rectangular shield that could be planted in the ground, protected crossbowmen as they reloaded. Bucklers, small, fist-held shields, were ubiquitous for personal duels and urban self-defense. The shield's disappearance from the knight's harness was not a failure of design, but the ultimate proof of its success. It faded away because the armor itself had finally become perfect enough to make it obsolete, a silent victory for the smiths who had spent centuries trying to build a man who was his own fortress. The disappearance of the shield marked a final confidence in the armor itself, a confidence born from a style that turned steel into a kind of architectural marvel. This is the mystery of Gothic fluting, a signature of German workshops in the 15th century that transformed armor from protective equipment into a moving cathedral of steel. At first glance, these suits are breathtaking. Every surface is etched with sharp, parallel ridges and valleys, flowing from the pointed toes of the sabatons up the legs, across the sculpted curves of the breastplate, and over the sweeping lines of the sallet helmet. The entire harness shimmers with a play of light and shadow, an aesthetic of stark, elegant lines, but to dismiss this as mere decoration is to miss its revolutionary purpose. Each one of those flutes is a structural harness innovation. Think of a simple, flat sheet of cardboard. It bends easily, but take that same sheet and corrugate it, folding it into a series of ridges and grooves, and it becomes remarkably rigid, able to support weight far beyond its own. Gothic fluting applied this exact principle to steel armor. By hammering the metal into these sharp, alternating ridges, armorers created a three-dimensional lattice of incredible strength. The flutes acted like the ribs of a vaulted ceiling, distributing and resisting force across the entire plate. This meant a Gothic breastplate could be forged from a thinner, lighter sheet of steel than a smooth Italian counterpart, yet offer equal or even greater protection against a crushing blow. The weight saved was not trivial. It could mean the difference between a fresh knight in the third hour of a battle and an exhausted one. But how was this achieved with the tools of the time? This is where the mystery deepens. Creating these precise, consistent flutes across complex, compound curves like a pauldron or a curved quiz was a task of almost unimaginable skill. The armorer did not have a stamping press or a roller. He had a hammer, a stake, an anvil, and his own calibrated eye. The process likely began with the rough shaping of the plate. Then, using specially shaped stakes with grooves that matched the desired flute, the armorer would painstakingly hammer the metal over these forms, gradually raising the ridge from the inside out. It was a dance of incremental force, requiring an intimate understanding of how steel stretches and flows under the hammer. A single misplaced blow could create a weak spot or crack the metal, ruining weeks of work. The flutes also had a subtle defensive benefit beyond pure rigidity. When a sword's edge struck a fluted surface, the sharp ridge could catch and guide the blade, controlling its path and potentially causing it to skitter off at an unpredictable angle, disrupting an opponent's follow-through. This style did not stop at a single piece. It unified the entire harness into a cohesive visual and functional system. The fluting on the cuirass echoed in the vambraces, repeated on the polans, and culminated in the dramatically pointed shapes of the sabatons and the long, sweeping tail of the sallet. Every element spoke the same language of efficient, lightweight strength. To wear a full Gothic harness was to be encased in a masterpiece of metallurgical artistry, a suit that represented the absolute peak of medieval engineering, where every beautiful line was secretly a calculation for survival, and the hammer's song was written directly into the steel. While the German Gothic style spoke in sharp, fluted ridges, Italian workshops sang a different song in steel. Their masterpiece was known as white armor, a harness of breathtaking simplicity and flawless polish. Imagine not a cathedral of intricate lines, but a sculpture of liquid mercury, its surfaces smooth, rounded, and buffed to a blinding mirror finish. This was the aesthetic of power favored by the wealthy condottieri, the professional mercenary captains of Italy, and the nobles who could afford the very best. Its beauty was not in decoration, but in a perfect, unbroken curve. The functional reason for this smoothness was brutally direct. On the jousting tilt or the chaotic battlefield, a lance point or sword edge that struck a fluted surface might catch momentarily in a groove, transferring more of its energy into the armor. A perfectly smooth, rounded surface, however, offered nothing to catch. It was designed to be the ultimate glancing plane, making every blow skid off at a shallow angle, its force harmlessly deflected away from the body. It was armor that used physics as its primary defense. This perfection did not happen by accident. It was the product of fiercely guarded secrets held within the powerful armorers' guilds of cities like Milan and Venice. These were not just trade associations, they were intellectual monopolies. A master armorer in Milan spent years, often a decade or more, as an apprentice and journeyman, learning a sequence of techniques known only within the workshop walls. The mystery begins with the steel itself. Italian armorers had access to high-quality iron and mastered methods of refining it into consistent, workable plates. But the true secret lay in the hammer, creating those flawless, compound curves. Like the deeply rounded breastplate that seemed to swell from the chest, required a technique called raising. Starting with a flat disc of steel, the armorer would heat it and then, with a rhythmic, precise dance of hammer blows from the center outward over a rounded stake, he would gradually dish the metal into a bowl and then further shape it into the complex form of a cuirass. This process stretched and thinned the metal in a controlled way, work hardening it and creating an incredibly strong, lightweight shell. Any flaw, any uneven thickness would be a weak point. The final, legendary step was the polish. Using progressively finer abrasives, from coarse sand to powdered pumice and finely felt wheels, apprentices would spend weeks buffing a single suit until it reflected the world like a still pool. This mirror finish was not vanity. A brightly polished surface was easier to inspect for cracks or flaws, and some believed the blinding glare could momentarily disorient an opponent in the sun. The harness design philosophy followed this principle of flawless function. Italian white armor focused on robust, simple shapes with articulation that was often hidden or internalized. You would not see the elaborate, external sliding rivets of some German suits. Instead, the lames of the pauldrons or fald were connected by internal leathers, their joints clean and seamless. The overall impression was one of solidity and flowing form, like the musculature of a classical statue rendered in steel. It often lacked the elaborate etching or gilt borders of its northern counterparts, though the very richest patrons might add engraved bands or gilded edges. Its excellence was in pure, reliable battlefield protection. A Milanese harness was built to be resilient, to take the brutal shock of combat and keep its wearer alive through superior metallurgy and perfect deflection. This created a fascinating, centuries-long rivalry between the regional schools. Was it better to be light and rigid with fluted strength, or solid and deflective with smooth, perfect curves? Knights and nobles across Europe took sides, often ordering elements from both traditions. This competition drove innovation to its peak, a silent conversation between hammers across the Alps that gave the medieval warrior a choice not just in armor, but in the very philosophy of his protection. The mirror-smooth perfection of Italian white armor was the pinnacle of the armorer's art, but it was a luxury reserved for princes and generals. For the common soldier of the 16th century, the dream of wearing plate armor became a reality through a revolution in production. The Almain rivet harness was a name that spoke of international trade and industrial pragmatism. Almain was the English term for Germany, and rivet referred to the visible, functional fastenings that held it together. This was not a suit crafted for a single night, but a munitions-grade half-armor produced in vast quantities in German workshops, specifically for export to equip the armies of King Henry VIII of England. Its typical configuration was brutally efficient: a breastplate and backplate to protect the core, a skirt of tassets for the thighs, and simple, solid defenses for the arms, often leaving the legs free for marching. It was a harness stripped to its essential elements, a tool for survival rather than a symbol of status. The profound mystery of the Almain rivet lies not in its design, but in its existence. How did medieval workshops, built on the tradition of bespoke craftsmanship, suddenly learn to mass-produce functional plate armor? The answer was a new philosophy of standardization. Instead of painstakingly shaping each piece to fit an individual, armorers created sets of templates. Breastplates were hammered into a limited range of sizes: small, medium, and large. Components like tassets and vambraces were made to be interchangeable, so a piece from one crate could be matched with another from a different batch and still fit together. The construction made no attempt to hide its utilitarian nature. The edges of the plates were often left rough from the shears, the surfaces were left with a coarse, hammered finish, and the rivets that held the straps and lames were prominent and purely functional. This was armor built for speed and scale, where the goal was to produce 500 serviceable harnesses, not one perfect one. This shift democratized plate armor in a way never seen before. For the first time, a professional foot soldier, a pikeman or a halberdier or a light cavalryman could be issued a core defense of steel. It changed the landscape of the battlefield, creating units where every man had a chance against slashing swords and glancing blows. The Almain rivet represents a pivotal, quiet transition in the history of harness design. It marks the moment the medieval world of the individual knightly harness, a masterpiece fitted to a single man's body, began its transformation into the standardized military equipment of the Renaissance, where the needs of the army finally outweighed the art of the armorer. The Almain rivet harness made armor common, but the true final masterpiece of the knightly age was a hybrid of breathtaking ambition. Named for the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, this early 16th century style represents a conscious, brilliant fusion of the two great schools of armor. It took the German love for fluting and married it to the Italian preference for rounded, deflective shapes, creating a harness that was both structurally ingenious and stunningly ornate. Its appearance is unmistakable. Instead of the sharp, narrow flutes of Gothic armor, Maximilian armor is covered in broad, shallow grooves that run in parallel bands across almost every surface. These flutes are not just decorative lines, they are wide channels that strengthen the plates while maintaining a smooth, continuous curve, a perfect compromise between rigidity and deflection. This was armor designed in an age of terrifying transition, when the knight on horseback faced a new and deafening enemy, the handheld gun. The breastplate of a Maximilian harness tells this story silently. It is often dramatically globose, swelling outwards in a deep, rounded curve. This shape, sometimes called a peascod, was not a fashion statement. It was a calculated armorer's solution to a new problem. By creating more space between the steel and the wearer's body, it increased the angle at which a crossbow bolt, or, more critically, an early lead bullet from an arquebus would strike. A projectile hitting this steeply angled surface was far more likely to glance off sideways, its force dissipated, rather than punch a hole straight through. Many of these breastplates were also deliberately thickened at the center, becoming the first true bulletproof vests, tested or proofed against the firearms of the day. This proofing was a literal, violent guarantee. Armorers would fire a pistol at a discrete spot on the finished breastplate, often near the edge, and the dented but unpierced metal would stand as proof of its quality. That dent left in the steel was a badge of honor and a warranty, yet this raises a compelling mystery about the Maximilian harness. Was it truly meant for the chaotic battlefield now dominated by gunpowder smoke, or was it the ultimate armor for pageantry, a final, glorious statement of chivalry in a changing world? The answer is likely both. Its exaggerated forms speak to dual purposes. The famous bear paw sabatons became wider and more squared than ever, creating a stable, imposing platform. The pauldrons grew into enormous, layered shells, and the gauntlets were often intricately fluted masterworks. These elements provided superb protection, but they also created a silhouette of immense power and prestige, a walking sculpture of imperial authority. A fully armored Maximilian knight was a symbol of an old order asserting its relevance through sheer, breathtaking engineering. It was the last, brilliant evolution of the medieval harness, an attempt to answer the gun with better steel and smarter shapes. But it was also a magnificent sunset. Within a few decades, the increasing power and reliability of firearms would make the full plate harness, no matter how well proofed or brilliantly designed, too heavy and too costly for the realities of war. The Maximilian style, in all its fluted and ridged glory, stands at that precise crossroads where the armored knight, perfected over centuries, made his final, defiant stand against the future. That final, defiant stand of the Maximilian knight was made possible by a secret he wore against his skin. Beneath all that fluted steel and polished plate, the true anchor of the entire harness was a humble, quilted jacket. This was the arming doublet, or pourpoint, and its ingenious system of laces was the hidden network that held the medieval warrior together. Think of it not as clothing, but as the central docking station for a suit of armor. This was no delicate undershirt. It was a sturdy, purpose-built garment, heavily padded across the shoulders and chest, with tightly fitted sleeves. Its fabric was tough linen or leather, designed to withstand immense strain. And sewn at precise locations all over its surface were dozens upon dozens of short leather laces, known as points. These were the literal ties that bound. The mystery of dressing for battle was a meticulous, three-dimensional puzzle. Every piece of plate armor, the vambrace for the forearm, the cuisse for the thigh, the pallion for the knee, had small pairs of holes or tiny metal staples along its edges. The knight, with the practiced help of his squire, would begin by putting on this padded doublet. Then, piece by articulated piece, the squire would lift a steel component, align it perfectly on the knight's limb or torso, and begin the lacing. He would take a leather point from the doublet, thread it through the matching holes on the armor, and tie it off in a secure knot. This was repeated again and again across the body until every plate was individually anchored to the quilted foundation beneath. This intricate pointing system solved two critical problems of weight and unity. First, it distributed the crushing load of the armor. Instead of the full weight of a cuisse hanging from a belt or dragging on a hip, its weight was transferred through those leather points and into the padded shoulders and torso of the doublet. The burden was shared across the entire body, making 60 pounds of steel feel manageable. Second, and more importantly, it created a seamless bond between man and metal. Because each piece was tied directly to his base layer, the armor moved with him. When he raised his arm, the pauldron and rerebrace pivoted exactly with his shoulder. When he bent his knee, the laminated plates of the pollen collapsed in sync with his joint. There was no lag, no clumsy shifting of heavy plates that could throw off his balance or leave a gap exposed. The knight and his harness became a single, integrated entity. The comfort and security this provided cannot be overstated. A poorly fitted harness was a death trap. It could pinch, bind, and exhaust its wearer before a fight even began. But a harness properly pointed to a well-made doublet felt like a second skin, a responsive exoskeleton. It allowed for the precise, dynamic movements documented in fighting manuals, the rapid steps, the powerful swings, the controlled grapples. The final act of this ritual was often the donning of the helmet, sealing the knight inside his mobile fortress. Once the last point was tied, he was no longer a man wearing armor. He was the armor itself, a unified instrument of war, held together by a network of simple leather cords and the profound ingenuity of a humble quilted jacket. The intricate web of leather points that held a harness together was the final secret of its assembly, but the steel itself holds deeper, more elusive mysteries. For all the magnificent suits preserved in museums, there are entire chapters of the armorer's craft that are simply gone, techniques lost to the silence of guild secrecy and the passing of masters who never wrote their recipes down. These were not simple blacksmiths, but metallurgical artists whose workshops were vaults of proprietary knowledge. The questions that haunt modern historians and craftsmen today are not just about what they made, but how they achieved it with such astonishing consistency. Consider the most fundamental process, heat treatment. To make steel both hard and resilient, it must be heated to a precise temperature, quenched to set its hardness, and then tempered to relieve brittleness. Medieval armorers had no pyrometers, no digital readouts. Their thermometer was the color of the glowing metal in the dim forge light, a spectrum of reds, oranges, and yellows learned through a lifetime of experience. A master could judge a critical temperature shift by the faintest change in the steel's shimmer, a skill as intuitive and perishable as a chef's perfect touch. Even more mysterious are the specific alloys they worked with. We know they produced steel of remarkable quality, but the exact compositions, the trace amounts of carbon, phosphorus, and other elements that varied from mine to mine, were likely trade secrets. An armorer in Milan might have had a source for iron ore that, when processed in his particular way, yielded a plate that was uniquely flexible and strong. That recipe died with him and his guild. The planning of a full harness from raw materials is another profound puzzle. How did a master, working from a single large sheet of iron called a bloom, mentally map out the cutting plan for an entire suit? He had to envision the complex curves of the breastplate, the long strips for the tassets, the smaller pieces for the gauntlet gadlings, all nested within that irregular slab to minimize waste. This was three-dimensional chess played with a hammer, an exercise in spatial genius we can only guess at. Then there are the finishing mysteries, like the processes for bluing or blackening armor. These were not just for aesthetics. By heating the steel to specific temperatures and exposing it to controlled atmospheres or chemical baths, armorers could create a thin, stable layer of oxide on the surface. This blued finish, often seen as a deep midnight hue, provided remarkable corrosion resistance, a vital feature for equipment that faced rain, sweat, and blood. The exact methods, using mixtures of oil, vinegar, or other organic compounds, were closely guarded. Perhaps the greatest lost secret is the creation of spring steel for critical components like visor pivots and the catches on armets. This is steel that must flex and return to shape millions of times without fatigue. Achieving this property requires a perfect understanding of carbon content and a tempering process that leaves the metal with a specific internal tension. We have no surviving medieval recipe for it. Modern smiths can recreate the forms, but they admit they are often reverse engineering the effect without knowing the original path. This incomplete understanding is precisely what adds to the harness's enduring magic. Every polished curve is a question mark. Every silent, smooth articulation is a testament to a conversation between hammer and metal that we can no longer fully hear. We can admire the result, but the whispered secrets of the forge, the true language of those harnesses, are echoes we are still straining to understand. The whispers of the forge held secrets not just for the perfect warrior, but for the wounded one as well. Harness design reached its most profoundly personal level when it was crafted for a knight who had already paid a brutal price. History is clear: armor was not abandoned after a devastating injury, it was reinvented. The most famous testament to this is the German knight Gotz von Berlichingen. In the early 1500s, during the Siege of Landshut, a cannonball tore through his right hand, forcing its amputation. For most men, this would have ended a martial career. For Gotz, it was the beginning of a legend. He commissioned a master craftsman to create an intricate iron prosthetic hand, a marvel of early biomechanics. Its fingers could be locked into position individually, allowing him to hold a shield strap, grip a horse's reins, or even, as legend insists, sign his name. But this iron hand did not exist in a vacuum. It was the centerpiece of a completely customized harness. His armorers faced a unique puzzle: how do you armor a prosthetic limb? The iron gauntlet covering his prosthetic was likely a permanent fixture, riveted or strapped directly to the complex mechanism of the hand itself, rather than being a separate, articulated piece he could take on and off. It would have been simpler in design, a solid shell without the delicate finger gaddlings, built for utility over fine manipulation. The entire right side of his harness, from the pauldron down, was probably tailored to accommodate this rigid, unfeeling appendage. The weight distribution would have been carefully considered, and the attachment points for his sword harness may have been completely rethought, for Gotz learned to fight left-handed. His scabbard was likely repositioned to hang on his left hip for a cross-body draw with his natural hand, and the balance of his swords may have been altered to suit his new dominant side. This was not a suit of armor for parades. He wore this customized harness back into battle for decades, earning his enduring nickname, Gotz of the Iron Hand. His story illuminates a broader, often overlooked truth. Other knights with lasting injuries, a stiff knee from a poorly healed fracture, a shoulder damaged by a dislocation, would have had their harnesses subtly modified. A pollon might be lined with extra padding, or its articulation limited to protect a fragile joint. A pauldron might be cut away or reshaped to avoid pressure on a scarred area. This reveals the medieval harness as something far beyond a mass-produced shell. It was a deeply personal technology, a collaborative project between a warrior's broken body and an armorer's problem-solving genius. It was a statement that the will to fight could forge its own tools, and that the metal meant to stop a blade could also, with enough ingenuity, help a man hold one again. A knight's customized harness was a testament to personal resilience, but on the crowded medieval battlefield, most men wore armor designed for a specific, brutal job. For the archer and the crossbowman, the harness was a constant, vital compromise. Their survival depended on a single, non-negotiable requirement: the armor must never interfere with the act of shooting. A brigandine or a sturdy jack of plate was the perfect solution for the torso. These garments offered excellent protection against slashing cuts and, crucially, could stop or slow an arrow, yet their flexible, layered construction allowed for the full, powerful rotation of the shoulders needed to draw a 6-foot yew longbow to the ear. On their heads, the open-faced sallet helmet reigned supreme. It provided essential protection for the skull and neck, while preserving the wide, panoramic vision an archer needed to track distant troop movements, judge wind, and aim at a high angle into a mass of advancing men. Their limbs were often guarded by voiders of mail sleeves and gussets tied beneath a leather jerkin, defending the vulnerable inner arm and armpit from a stray arrow or a sudden cavalryman's sword without restricting the draw. But look down and you would see the most telling part of the compromise. An archer on foot almost never wore heavy greaves or sabatons. That weight and rigidity would have been a deadly hindrance. He needed to move quickly to advance, retreat, and reposition across muddy, broken ground. His legs had to be free to brace against the earth, to feel the footing, and to allow him to kneel or take cover behind stakes. This was a harness of selective protection, a calculated gamble that placed supreme value on the weapon's function. This brings us to a persistent modern myth, the image of the English longbowman as a lightly clad peasant in a linen shirt. Contemporary muster rolls, wills, and even the archaeological evidence from battlefields like Toten tell a different, more nuanced story. While not clad in full knightly plate, the professional yeoman archer was a valuable military asset, and he invested in good equipment. It was common for such men to own a brigandine, a sallet, and mail sleeves. They were not frontline tanks, but they were far from defenseless. The strategic logic was impeccable. Their harness needed to be just enough to turn a glancing sword cut, to stop a spent arrow falling from the sky, and to provide a fighting chance if enemy men-at-arms broke through to their position. But it also had to be light enough to allow the relentless, muscle-tearing pace of shooting that made them so terrifying, a dozen aimed shots a minute, each capable of piercing mail at 200 yards. Their armor was not a wall, but a shield balanced perfectly against the devastating weapon they served, a harness designed not for the glory of the charge, but for the grim, rain-soaked efficiency of the killing field. But for every knight in his Maximilian harness, there stood 100 men whose armor told a different story. The common infantryman's kit was a harness of brutal pragmatism, a defensive system built from whatever could be scavenged, salvaged, or afforded. This was not a unified suit, but a personal patchwork of survival. On his head, he might wear the simple, dependable kettle hat, a wide-brimmed steel bowl that deflected downward blows and rain with equal efficiency, or perhaps an open-faced sallet passed down from a fallen comrade. For his torso, the dream was a brigandine or a jack of plate, but the reality was often just a thick, quilted gambeson, stained and patched from years of service. If he was fortunate, a veteran might have acquired a pair of mail voiders to tie beneath his armpits, or a single, mismatched greave strapped to his leading leg. His harness was an autobiography written in rust and repair, each piece bearing the marks of its own history, a dent from a past battle, a replacement strap of different leather, a crude rivet hammered in by a camp blacksmith. This practical, piecemeal approach presents one of the greatest archaeological puzzles. When excavating a mass grave from a battle like Toten or Bosworth, historians do not find neat, complete suits laid out in orderly rows. They find a cryptic scatter. A single skeleton might be surrounded by a kettle hat, the rusted rivets of a jack scattered across its ribs, and the remains of one leather shoe with a hobnail pattern. The other greave, the missing vambrace, the other shoe, they are gone, looted by the living in the grim aftermath. Piecing together these assembled harnesses is like trying to reconstruct a library from a handful of torn, single pages. The evidence is fragmentary and silent. Was this man an archer who discarded his leg armor for mobility? Was he a pikeman who prioritized a good helmet and a thick gambeson? Or was he simply wearing everything he had ever owned or taken, a walking archive of a soldier's hard life? This patchwork defense was the true backbone of medieval armies. While the glorious charge of knights captures the imagination, it was the dense, resilient ranks of these common soldiers, their mixed harness glinting in 1,000 different ways, that held the line, broke the enemy formations, and ultimately decided the fate of kingdoms. Their kit was not about heraldic display or perfect articulation. It was about a simple, desperate calculation. How do you balance maximum protection with the ability to march 20 miles in a day, to wield a 16-foot pike, or to swing a heavy halberd for hours on end. Their harness was the answer, a compromise forged in the reality of limited means and unlimited danger. It speaks to a world where personal defense was a deeply individual concern, a collection of hard-won treasures that stood between a man and the chaos of the medieval battlefield. In their varied, practical kit, we see not the failure of the armorer's art, but its democratization, proof that the desire for a harness, for any shield against the storm of war, was a universal human instinct. The battlefield was a forge of necessity, but the royal court was a theater of dreams. In the glittering halls of kings and emperors, armor shed its brutal purpose and became a canvas for myth and power. This was ceremonial and parade harness, a defense system built not to stop a lance, but to proclaim a dynasty. These suits were masterpieces of illusion, often constructed from steel so richly decorated it seemed spun from gold and shadow. Armorers collaborated not just with blacksmiths, but with etchers who engraved intricate scenes of Hercules or St. George across breastplates, and goldsmiths who applied delicate filigree and solid gilt. The steel itself was transformed through chemical processes into deep blues and shimmering blacks, creating a backdrop that made the gold scenes blaze like fire. This was a harness of pure prestige, where every surface told a story of divine right and classical learning, visible only to the privileged few in a sunlit courtyard or a torchlit hall. But this artistic triumph created a fascinating contradiction. Many of these magnificent suits were, in practical terms, delicate lies. To achieve their breathtaking detail, the steel was often worked thinner, making it dangerously lightweight for real combat. Articulation was sometimes sacrificed for a seamless artistic surface. A gauntlet might be etched with a perfect vine pattern, but its fingers were fused into a single, sculpted unit, completely unable to grasp a sword. Some components were purely theatrical, like the tonlet. This was a rigid, bell-shaped skirt of steel plates worn for foot combats in tournaments. It provided excellent defense for the legs while allowing a nobleman to move with a dignified, sweeping gait, but its fixed form would have been a fatal hindrance on a real battlefield or on horseback. Elaborate helmet crests featuring dragons, plumes, or entire heraldic beasts were designed for visibility and awe, not deflection. Their attachment was often precarious, meant to survive a procession, not a crushing blow. The mystery of their creation is one of shared genius. An armorer would forge the basic form, ensuring it fit the prince's body with majestic elegance. Then the suit would pass to the etcher, who used fine chisels to incise the detailed designs, often working from patterns provided by a court painter. Finally, the goldsmith would apply layers of gold leaf or mercury gilding, a toxic and spectacular process that bonded pure gold to the steel. This collaboration blurred the lines between craftsman and artist, between workshop and studio. Their ultimate purpose was equally layered. These harnesses were the stars of pageants and parades, where a ruler could appear as a god or a legendary hero made flesh, solidifying his image through breathtaking spectacle. They also served as the ultimate diplomatic gifts. Sending a suit of gorgeously decorated armor to a foreign court was a statement of immense respect and a subtle display of your own kingdom's technical and artistic wealth. It showed you could afford to turn the tools of war into objects of peace. In the end, ceremonial armor represents the final, fascinating evolution of the harness. It completed a journey that began with the simple need to stop a blade and ended with the complex desire to project an idea. It was armor that protected not the body, but the myth of the man who wore it, a glittering shell where the only battle fought was for legacy, witnessed not by soldiers, but by history itself. The ceremonial harness was a glittering lie, but the gunpowder age demanded a brutal new truth. The medieval arms race reached its final, deafening chapter not with refinement of the lance or sword, but with the thunderous crack of the arquebus. Armorers now faced a puzzle that defied centuries of tradition: how to stop a small, dense lead ball moving faster than the eye could see. The answer was not more articulation, but more steel. Enter the proofed breastplate, a piece of armor that wore its validation as a badge of honor. These breastplates were visibly, deliberately thicker at their center, forged to withstand a point-blank test. An armorer would secure the finished plate and fire a pistol or musket at it from a prescribed distance. If the ball did not penetrate, it left a deep, unmistakable dent, the proof mark. This was not a flaw to be hidden, but a warranty stamped in violence, a guarantee to the buyer that this steel could save his life against the new terror of the battlefield. The entire philosophy of the harness began to simplify and focus. The beautiful, full body coverage of the Gothic and Maximilian suits became a liability. It was too heavy, too expensive, and unnecessary against an enemy who fought in massed ranks with guns, so armor retreated to protect only the essentials. By the 17th century, the archetypal armored warrior was the cuirassier, a heavy cavalryman clad in a sturdy, three-quarter harness. He wore a robust breastplate and backplate, a heavy helmet, and perhaps a single, long tasset for the left thigh. His arms and legs below the knee were often protected only by thick leather boots and gloves. This was a harness of stark economy. Why waste steel on a limb when a musket ball to the torso meant instant death? The weight saved was reinvested into the thickness of the breastplate, creating a mobile, heavily armored core that could still charge into the fray. This leads to the enduring mystery: why did cavalry cling to plate long after infantry had abandoned it? The answer lies in momentum and psychology. A formed block of infantry could unleash a devastating volley, but reloading took time. A charge of cuirassiers, their horses and riders encased in steel, was designed to smash into that vulnerable moment. Their armor gave them the confidence to ride into the face of gunfire, knowing that at anything but point-blank range, their proofed breastplates might turn the shot. They were the last shock troops of the armored age. Their signature helmet tells this story of stubborn adaptation. The lobster-tailed pot helmet, with its rounded skull, barred face guard, and distinctive overlapping plates guarding the neck, looked like a medieval sallet that had been reinforced for a darker purpose. It offered good protection and reasonable vision, a final compromise between the old world and the new, but it was a compromise with a deadline. As firearms became more powerful, accurate, and rapid, even the thickest proofed breastplate could be defeated. The weight required to stop a bullet became absurd, condemning the wearer to immobility. The glorious 500-year journey of the full harness, from the mail hauberk to the fluted Maximilian suit, was reaching its end. The cuirassier's armor was its last gasp, a pragmatic, simplified echo of the medieval dream, increasingly specialized to meet a threat that would ultimately make the dream obsolete. The age of the armored knight, of the harness as a second skin, was closing not with a parry of steel, but with the silent, final click of a musket's hammer falling on an empty pan. The thunder of the arquebus seemed to end the story, but it only changed the materials. The medieval armorer's greatest puzzles never faded. They simply found new forms in laboratories and factories. The legacy of those 34 harness designs is not locked in museum cases, but is woven into the very fabric of modern personal protective equipment. The principles they forged in fire and hammer are the same ones that protect lives today. Consider the most fundamental concept: layered defense. A knight system of a soft gambeson, a flexible mail voiders, and a rigid plate cuirass is a perfect analog for the modern soldier's armor. The soft, fibrous gambeson is today's Kevlar vest, a woven layer designed to catch and disperse the energy of a high-velocity projectile, just as padding absorbed the shock of a mace. The rigid plate is the ceramic or polyethylene trauma plate inserted into that vest, a hard shell meant to shatter a bullet upon impact, mirroring the way a breastplate deflected a lance. This hybrid approach, perfected centuries ago, remains the gold standard because it solves the same brutal equation: how to stop a penetrating threat without transferring lethal force to the body behind it. Look at the articulation of a 15th century gauntlet, with its dozens of tiny, overlapping gadlings allowing a knight to make a fist. That same engineering philosophy protects a bomb disposal technician today. The complex joints of an EOD suit, with their segmented plates and flexible connectors, are direct descendants of those medieval lames and sliding rivets, allowing crucial dexterity within an impervious shell. Even the decorative fluting of Gothic armor, those ridges that added strength without weight, lives on in the ribbed plastic of a motorcycle helmet or a hockey goalie's leg guards. The shape is the science, using geometry to turn a thin material into a rigid shield. Perhaps the most profound shared challenge is weight distribution. A medieval armorer spent his life figuring out how to make 60 pounds of steel feel like a second skin, using points, straps, and shaped plates to transfer load to the shoulders, hips, and legs. Modern engineers face the identical problem with a soldier's combat load, which can exceed 100 pounds. The solution is the same: a harness. The modern tactical vest, with its padded shoulders, adjustable cummerbund, and hip belt, is not a bag. It is a sophisticated load-bearing system, a direct echo of the arming doublet's network of points, designed to anchor weight intelligently to the body's strongest frames. The goal is identical: to keep the wearer mobile, agile, and combat effective under a burden meant for survival. This continuity reveals a stunning truth. The medieval armorer was not a mere blacksmith. He was a brilliant materials scientist and a biomechanical engineer. He worked without computers, but with an intimate, tactile understanding of force, deflection, and human anatomy. The problems he dedicated his life to solving: protection versus mobility, rigidity versus flexibility, coverage versus weight, are the eternal constants of personal defense. The materials have evolved from wrought iron to aramid fibers and advanced ceramics. The threats have changed from broadswords to high-velocity rifles. But the core harness design philosophy, that intricate dance of pieces working in concert to protect a living, moving person, remains unbroken. Every time a police officer adjusts the straps on a ballistic vest, or a soldier checks the plates in their carrier, they are participating in a tradition that is half a millennium old. The medieval knight's greatest legacy is not the suit of armor in the castle hall, but the invisible one worn by those who still stand on the line, their safety secured by principles forged in a distant, yet intimately familiar, age. And so we reach the end of this journey through steel and ingenuity, from the foundational weave of the male hauberk to the final, defiant fluting of the Maximilian harness. We have explored 35 vital designs, each a critical piece in a 500-year puzzle of survival. What began as a simple need to stop a blade evolved into one of history's most sophisticated mechanical arts. These were never just metal suits. They were integrated life support systems, each strap, buckle, and articulated lame the result of countless hours at the forge, solving brutal problems of physics, anatomy, and warfare. They speak of a hidden world of guild secrets and regional rivalries, where a master's touch could mean the difference between a glorious charge and a silent grave. They are stories of personal identity, from the heraldry blazing on a tabard to the subtle proof mark hidden inside a cuirass, a craftsman's quiet signature. Most of all, they are the physical record of an eternal arms race, a relentless dialogue between the weapon that seeks to pierce and the harness engineered to deflect. Every dent, every polished groove, every carefully patched void tells a part of that story. So, as the echoes of the hammer fade, we are left with a question for you. Which of these harness designs captured your imagination the most? Was it the deceptive elegance of the hidden brigandine, the microscopic engineering of the articulated gauntlet, or the sheer, imposing presence of the great helm? Share your favorite in the comments below. We would love to hear what piece of this puzzle resonated with you. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the mysteries of medieval armor, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. There are countless more hidden corners of history waiting to be explored, and we would be honored to have you join us for the next journey.